Hey, hoping you're having a fantastic day. So this is my patron stream for what's today? Wednesday, May 31st. So if you're not a patron and you're seeing this, uh, this is a substantial portion of the stream that's still going to cover a lot of stuff. Don't worry. You're still going to get basically the gist of it. But if you want to be a patron and see the whole thing and get the whole thing every single week, it's available for every patron, $5 and up. So it's $5 a month. I just do these because sometimes there's topics that I don't really want to cover in like a wide scale sort of super authoritative way, but they're just interesting, and I think people find them interesting. Or I don't like doing the big public response videos or anything like that, and sometimes people want me to do that. So I just provide a little part for the public, and then I get the rest of it on Patreon. So if you want to, go to patreon.com/militant-thomist, and you can get the whole video there. But let us begin. So why am I doing this video on the interpretation of Scripture and how to interpret Scripture as a Catholic? Well, just generally, I found an issue that is something that has been repeated time and time again by the popes when it comes to Catholics' interpretive techniques with Scripture. Basically, the popes over and over again, they are complaining that when Catholics are interpreting Scripture, a lot of them, rather than following our own tradition of interpretation, such as, for example, let's see, I got one right here. For example, St. Thomas's commentary on the book of Job, probably one of the best commentaries on a book of Scripture ever written. Oh, no, why not? There it is. They're not following the interpretive method of somebody like St. Thomas. They're following the interpretive method of seculars, basically. And they actually do differ for many different reasons that we are going to bring up, chief of which has to do with the nature of supernatural revelation. It's going to change the way in which you interpret Shakespeare and St. Paul. They're going to have the connection of the fact that it's communication through signs, but due to the supernatural nature of the communication of Scripture, it's going to make some differences. So there's actually a very particular way in which Catholics engage in scriptural interpretation. Not only when it comes to the way in which one does theology, but also the way in which one reads Scripture devotionally. Really, every single part of our engagement with Scripture is going to be something which is different than your average secular or higher critic. We just read Scripture differently. We have different axioms when it comes to scriptural inerrancy, when it comes to the inspiration of Scripture, when it comes to what is canonical. Because for a Catholic, it's going to matter when you have Jonah saying something, and when you have Paul saying something. Those two are actually going to have some sort of connection. We're going to be able to draw forth a proper interpretation from them. But for a secular, they're going to say, what the heck does this random Old Testament book have to do with Paul? Except maybe Paul was somehow drawing from it for a point that he was making in his epistles. But we, on the other hand, believe in inspiration. So we believe that God is the author of every single book, every single sentence, every single word of sacred Scripture. And that's what we're bound to profess. So let's just begin right here. And if you're watching the public stream and you want this hat, merch description below. So when it comes to Scripture, we begin with a, I guess, natural philosophy of the way in which language works. Because the way in which grace perfects nature, because as we know, scriptural communication in the words of sacred Scripture, it's a certain type of communication through artificial signs. That is, it's a certain type of communication through words. So it's actually because grace is going to perfect nature, it's not going to destroy it. We need to know something about the way in which natural interpretation works, the way in which hermeneutics works. That's generally what this branch of grammar is called, hermeneutics. We're going to need to know how we interpret stuff, just generally, not even a sort of Christianized interpretive approach. So when it comes to the way in which Catholics are going to approach this, we're going to follow Aristotle's On Interpretation. On Interpretation is a work basically about terms and how these terms fit into propositions, and that's going to be extremely important when it comes to what we think about the interpretation of Scripture. We think terms immediately signify not things. We don't think terms immediately signify things. That's bad. A lot of Protestants are going to, well, at least some of the new Protestants are going to, as a reaction against certain modern tendencies, they're going to say that words are going to immediately signify things. That's going, and there's therefore some sort of intrinsic value to terms. That's not true. That's not how the tradition holds it. If you don't believe me, read On Interpretation, Book 1, goes over this very well. Rather, terms, written terms, are going to immediately signify what are called the passions of the soul. Can immediately signify the passions of the soul, and immediately signify things through the mediation of the passions of the soul. So when we are interpreting any sort of text, it's actually a bit difficult. Except with sacred scripture, it's a bit different. But since it's supernatural, we're going to add another layer of difficulty, and it's going to change it a bit. Because when I read, for example, Shakespeare, in communicating the passions of his soul, there's something that happens from our sensory input. So we look at things, or we, on the one hand, we could look at things and have what are called phantasms in our intellect. And the other hand, we can have simple apprehension, which can have ideas in our intellect. And we go through all of these comparative, discursive processes and blah, 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 blah. We go through a bunch of stuff. A bunch of stuff happens within our soul. So sometimes when we form sentences, we make falsehoods, false attributions. We may use terms which aren't apt to describe what we wish to describe. There's a bunch of different issues that occurs. So actually, when it comes to the interpretation of most texts, it's going to be this distinction between immediate signification of the passions of the soul and immediate signification of the things that are apprehended. That's actually going to make a big difference when it comes to how we are going to interpret and how we understand authorial intent. Now, when it comes to sacred scripture is a very unique book. I'm sure we can all agree to this. But when it comes to sacred scripture, we have to think now on a completely different level. It's a completely different level. Because we are going to have to think about, on the one hand, and this is important, supernatural communication. So we are having terms which are describing supernatural realities, and how the heck does that work? And on the other hand, we're also going to have to talk about what it means to have an infallible representation. Because now the distinction between the immediate representation of the passions of the soul of the author, and then in a metaphorical sense also of the passions of the soul of God. And then also, what is it going to happen when we have to think about the immediate representation of reality? Because they're going to be one and the same when you do have an infallible writer. So how the heck does this work out, and how does this differ? So when it comes to, sorry, I need to just type a note real quick that I just thought of. I don't want to forget it. Okay, so when it comes to the nature supernature sort of distinction, with natural terms and supernatural realities, there's some sort of analogy. There's said to be an analogy of proportionality. There can the terms could also be They can be either a proper proportionality or improper proportionality, depending on whether metaphors are used or not, but that's not important. But all this to say that our natural terms, if taken in a univocal sense, taken in a sense of proper species, are going to cause some trouble when it comes to interpreting the text. I will give an example. So when sacred scripture talks about the hatred of God, now we think about what hatred is when it comes to man. Hatred is a certain passion. So there's a certain sort of bubbling up in the soul. There's a certain sort of movement in the soul, a rage that happens. Now, can we say God, who is immutable, as we know from other texts in Scripture, there's no shadow of change. For example, from James, how can we know what that's supposed to mean? So, because you have these sort of natural images and natural terms that are having to be used to describe supernatural realities, oftentimes we're going to have to bleach the terms. We're going to have to bleach the terms. And what that means is we're going to have to take certain principles of the relationship between nature and grace when it comes to analogy. And we're going to have to take the terms and ask ourselves, what is the perfection being signified? What is the perfection being signified? And this is why, for example, biblicism is so ridiculous, because with biblicism, you're just going to fall into a big mess of contradiction. You can eventually reason out from the scriptures that God has a body or a right arm or the passion of anger or whatever it may be. You can reason out a lot of really wacky things if you're not keeping a lot of these thoughts in consideration. So when it comes to supernatural realities, we have to be very careful to ask ourselves what the perfection being signified is, because there's going to be this certain accommodation or lisping, you can say, of God to us, because Scripture wasn't written for the theologian. Scripture was written for the farmer or the gas station worker. Ancient version of gas station worker. It wasn't written for the theologian to have his playhouse in, but what you do have to recognize is that, as St. Gregory says, due to the depth of Scripture, and this accommodation is very purposeful, because the theologian can never find a bottom to it, but the young child can grasp something from it that is useful for him. So this is something very important when it comes to the nature supernature relation, where in natural text we just don't have that. We don't have to bleach the terms in the same ways. We just don't have to do it. So some can view St. Thomas, for example, as sort of putting his metaphysics above Scripture, or whatever sort of ridiculous claim it is. So no, actually, this is just when we look at how we interpret this type of text. This is the interpretive method we use. It's not like reading Moby Dick, James White, and that's something that James White says a lot. But it's not like reading Moby Dick. You can't just go and assume that the terms are adequate to represent the notion, because it's not some sort of lack on God's part. It's a lack on created language, and it's a lack on our own smallness. That's why we interpret Scripture in that sort of metaphysical way, rather than a merely philological analysis of the artificial signs, which is annoying. So next, we have to recognize, and this is going to make sense of a lot of things, what it means for us to have an infallible author. What the heck does it mean to have an infallible author? We're going to read things a lot differently, because you see, for example, when, let's say, I read a analysis of something in St. Thomas, what they're going to do is they're going to, for example, look. They want to know what St. Thomas believes about the causality of God's will on things. So they open up the Summa. They look. They read Article 19, Question 4. Question 19, Article 4. They read about God's will being the cause of things, and they come up with some sort of interpretation of what he's saying, acquiring the sense of St. Thomas's words. And then what they do is they look at the cross-reference sections. So he has one in Summa Contra Gentiles where he discusses this. He has it in, I think, De Potentia. He has it in the commentary on the sentences. He probably has a few sections in maybe his Pauline commentaries or one of his Quidlibet questions. What they do is they look throughout St. Thomas's other writings for an interpretation of St. Thomas, because he's his best interpreter. He might use different words, or he might explain things with different illustrations, and it's going to help us acquire the sense of St. Thomas. Now, let's say St. Thomas was somehow infallible. So we could, in that case, in order to interpret St. Thomas says, we could, let's say, go to Scripture. Because Scripture is infallible, or we could go to the tradition of the church, the magisterium, or we could even go to our natural loci. We could look at nature and such. And from this, we could find different ways of interpreting St. Thomas outside of St. Thomas, because since he infallibly is going to represent the object, and since those other sources are also going to infallibly represent the object, just as we went to other texts of St. Thomas to illustrate what he's saying, we could go to every single text ever to illustrate what he's saying. Every single text that's infallible to illustrate what he's saying, or directly to the source to see what he's saying, or maybe certain morally certain authorities, see what they're saying, because that's just how an infallible text would work. Now, when we get to sacred Scripture, it's much in the same way. We don't only have to stick in the scriptural text when it comes to our interpretation. Because if we believe that sacred Scripture, when it speaks about justice, is going to have an infallible notion of justice, we can go to other sources and look at what they have to say about justice. And we can, because God is going to perfectly represent the thing that is justice, we can look at justice from other angles, and we are going to, that notion of justice existing in reality and that notion of justice existing in Scripture are going to be identical. So this is going to make sense of a lot of the ways in which St. Thomas is going to interpret Scripture. Because you can read, for example, St. Paul talking about goodness. St. Paul says that this is good or that is good. And then St. Thomas is going to say, well, this is what like Plotinus or Proclus has to say about goodness. And this is true. Therefore, it can help us illuminate what Scripture means by goodness. How can we do this? Well, if you're thinking in a way of sort of philological analysis, the analysis of certain terms rather than the analysis of things which are signified by those terms, it's going to be very confusing, because you're like, well, St. Paul wasn't influenced by them and they weren't influenced by St. Paul. Well, no, they weren't. But they were influenced by that same notion of goodness. They were influenced by that same notion of goodness. So if Proclus can give us an insight into what goodness means, then it can give us insight into the interpretation of Scripture, because Scripture is going to perfectly interpret what goodness is for us. Now, it's not going to exhaustively interpret, and this is, there's going to be an objection, which is going to be like, well, if Scripture does it perfectly, why don't you just stick with Scripture? Why do you have to go to all of these external sources? Well, it doesn't exhaustively represent every little thing. Scripture isn't going to exhaustively tell us every single aspect of goodness. So if you can go somewhere else that truly speaks about goodness, you can help interpret Scripture by looking into something that's natural. And that just is something that's completely unique to sacred Scripture, since as we in other texts, there's that distinction between the immediate signification in words of the passions of the soul and the immediate signification through the soul of things. In sacred Scripture, those are identical, because there's the infallible nature of Scripture. So Scripture almost quasi immediately signifies things. Now, it's still through the mediation of the soul, obviously, but it's almost as if it was immediate due to the infallibility of sacred Scripture. So that I hope that makes sense, and I hope that wasn't confusing. So there's something else actually about the nature of scripture that is quite unique. So when it comes to God, um, God is not only the inspirer of those terms which signify things. So as we said, there's that immediate signification of terms to things. So let's say the word lamb is used in scripture. God is not only the creator of that term, which perfectly reflects lamb, but God is also the creator of lambs. He's the creator of lambness. So God does not only use terms as we do, because we are kind of stuck in this creation that we're in. We're stuck in creation, and we have to, with our own terms, use those terms to signify things, but we have no influence on the things, really. We can't invest things with meaning because we didn't create them, and only those that create can signify invest in meaning. We can only really compose artifacts. We can only take that which is created and mold it into something else, but we can't create natures out of nothing. Natures pre-exist our ability to create, and it's not something that we can create, because I would assume that we were able to somehow create certain forms, which is impossible. So when it comes to scripture is different, because God is both the author of the terms which signify the things, and the things which themselves can be invested with meaning. So when it comes to the signification of the terms on things, that's called the literal sense. The literal sense. So the terms signifying things. Now, this literal sense can be either proper or improper. So the proper literal sense is going to be without any sort of idiomatic or metaphorical form for putting the words in. So if we say God is love, that is an example of the proper literal sense, is just saying that God has that sort of aptitude in his will towards himself, towards goodness. That's what we mean with God is love. It's used in the proper sense. We don't need to somehow interpret this within literary form. We just need to explain the terms. But on the other hand, we may have the improper literal sense. So what's confusing for a lot of people is a lot of people think that the allegorical sense means somehow a different literary form or trope. That's false. That's wrong. That's not how the theologians have historically interpreted it. Rather, when it comes to the literal sense is just that which the terms signify. But terms can be put in certain idioms or literary forms. So the interpretation by way of literary forms that I think the Catechism talks about it, but also the Second Vatican Council and the new Pontifical Biblical Commission. I can't remember what the new Pontifical Biblical Commission is named. It still might be named the Pontifical Biblical Commission, but the new ITC group that deals with Scripture. When they talk about literary forms, such as different forms of parable or history or liturgical forms, or the various different forms in which literature can take, fiction, nonfiction, there's a lot of different forms in which it can take, ancient history, modern history. All of these different forms, reading stuff in accordance with them, that is still the literal sense. It's just the improper literal sense. So to give a super easy example, think of the story of the Good Samaritan. The literal sense of the story of the Good Samaritan is that we ought to help people in need. That's the literal sense. The literal sense isn't that some dude existed who was beat up and ignored and then helped. That isn't the literal sense of the story, because it has the literary form of parable. So the literal sense, and this literal sense is improper, is going to be to help those in need. Now, St. Augustine actually interprets this allegorically, and he talks about how this is man fallen in Adam, and so on and so forth. And the two coins are the coins of the Old and New Testaments. That would be an allegorical interpretation of the parable. But the literal sense of the parable is actually just helping people in need. So yeah. Or another example, the easy example is God has an arm. The literal sense of God has an arm isn't that God has some sort of fleshly member that he eternally has. No, the literal sense is that God has a certain power to him, because arm is usually an idiom for strength. Would that be an idiomatic term? Would that be a proper use of that term? I don't know. An idiomatic term. I haven't done grammar in a while for arm. So on the other hand, as I already said, God cannot only God doesn't only signify with terms. God also signifies with things. God signifies with things. So, for example, we have our first verse in Scripture. Beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then God says, let there be light. Let there be light. So let there be light, in the literal sense of this term, that's going to refer to, can anybody guess? Can anybody guess? There is light. That light, corporeal light, comes to be. That's what let there be light means in the literal sense. There isn't anything really fancy about it. Corporeal light came into being. That's what let there be light means in the literal sense. But God, as creator of light, does not only sort of use this term in sacred scripture to refer to or to signify light, but the thing that is light, that thing existing out in reality, itself is invested with meaning. God created everything with meaning. There's a certain quote from a church father. I haven't been able to find it since I read it, and it kind of frustrates me. But basically, the saying goes, God didn't use water in baptism because water cleanses and baptism spiritually cleanses. Actually, God made water clean things because God wanted something to signify baptism. So we think of God kind of like coming across all of these things that already have these natures he can create, and he's like, oh, okay, that's cool. I can now use this to signify my thing, like the Eucharistic bread, for example, and Eucharistic wine would be another one of these, or oil, and sort of significatory value for gladness, or even something like humanity and Christ. We think God sort of as a contingency plan came across and did these things. No, God created water as washing so that he would, in order to create a symbol for baptism. So there's a sort of priority to the supernatural order, because the supernatural order is the final cause, and the final cause is the cause of causes. That which is first in intention is last in execution. And the supernatural is that which is first in intention when it comes to nature. But all I mean by this is that when God creates things, he invests them with meaning. So God doesn't only signify with words, God also has that second layer of signifying with meaning. So let there be light. Those words, let there be light, signifies the coming into being of corporeal light. But corporeal light itself has been invested with meaning. Corporeal light can signify, and as it does signify in Scripture, can signify the illumination of the intellect, for example, or it can signify heavenly glory, or it can signify a certain purity and goodness. So when it comes to let there be light, we can interpret it not only according to the words, but according to the thing which it signifies. And this is what makes Catholic interpretation very unique. So there's going to be three of these senses of the spiritual sense. That is the signifying of things. So first is going to be the allegorical sense, which is going to signify the gospel, basically. It's going to signify the gospel from the Old Testament. Okay, let there be light. What could that be? What could that be? So who is the light of the world? Well, the light of the world is Christ. Light was created in a certain way in order to itself be a sign for Christ, who is going to illumine, who did illuminate all men. He's the light of the world. So let there be light, in its allegorical sense, is referring to the conception of Christ. We could say the conception of Christ, or maybe say the beginning of the public ministry of Christ. We could say a few different things. Second, we can think about what's called the anagogical sense, where earthly things are used to represent heavenly realities. So, what would be anagogically like light? Well, the beatific vision. The beatific vision is a certain illumination of the entire soul of man. So, let there be light in the anagogical sense would um, refer to our entrance into heavenly glory. So we can contemplate with that verse the beatific vision. And the third sense is the moral sense. The moral sense teaches us something about about our way of living. So let there be light. What does light have to do within the moral sense? Well, we see throughout sacred scripture, for example, in Psalm 119, that the precepts of God are as a light when it comes to our morals, when it comes to our moral living. So let there be light can be taken in a certain as a certain exhortation. So it could refer to the reading and meditating upon Scripture to illuminate our life. So we see that with the Catholic conception of Scripture, because of the way in which God's creation works, we see that we can, from just a single verse of Scripture, in considering the senses of Scripture, and this is something that you should be doing, to meditate upon Scripture by considering the senses of Scripture, you can get all of these senses out. Now, here we're running into an issue right now because a lot of people will misunderstand this. So when it comes to all of these senses of sacred Scripture, are these senses of sacred Scripture real? Are they real? It's a very, very important question. Are they real? Because some may say that that's sort of like an exterior imposition of us being able to apply Scripture. That's going to be the common Reformed position. The answer to this is no. And this has to do with what I kept saying before, with how God creates. God creates things which are invested with meaning. If you're talking about a mere sort of application, you're going to somehow chop up the way in which God is going to inspire texts. You're going to say that God has an act here, an act here, an act here, an act here. Well, no, actually, God's intellection and volition are both simple. And his decrees are only distinguished by having a what's called a virtual transiency. It's going to be something which is going to be on the part of the object. So God is going to, in inspiring one thing, going to have at mind implicitly everything. So when God is inspiring, let there be light, he's not only by referencing light going to be referring to corporeal light, but he's going to have in mind, due to the investing of meaning that we talked about before, every single way in which he's invested meaning into the text. So it is a true sense of Scripture. It is a true sense of Scripture, but it's not without danger, which the danger we're going to get into later, and some of the reasons why it can't be used, for example, in apologetic reasons, as St. Thomas teaches, or as St. Robert Bellarmine teaches, it's not going to be able to be even used in theology without some other source backing up the spiritual sense that's being drawn. So now I'm going to be getting into the norms of interpretation after now that we've gotten over some of the principles. So due to our views of our theology of tradition and the magisterium, the way in which we interpret Scripture, the norms of interpreting Scripture, also called the criteria of interpreting Scripture, are going to be a bit different for us. So when it comes to the interpretation of sacred Scripture, we're not only going to have in mind sacred Scripture. And this is something which we do with natural texts. As I said before, with if we were going to study St. Thomas, we're going to look at all that St. Thomas has to teach. That's a very normal thing to do. Is if you see and have difficulty with what an author is teaching, you look at the other stuff he's taught. So this is kind of the foundation for the rule that in interpreting Scripture, looking at clearer parts of Scripture can be helpful. But also, since we believe that the deposit of revelation that the magisterium and tradition act as a certain rule of faith. When it comes to the interpretation of Scripture, we're also going to look to them. And then also, this is in this part, I think is quite unique, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. As I said before, because Scripture is infallible, we can also look at certain things like philosophy, um, and true philosophy for the interpretation of Scripture. And I think it's perfectly valid to do that. Again, just because of the way in which nature and grace relate, it's going to help us interpret Scripture a lot better. It's really going to be helpful. But obviously, philosophy is said to be an improper locus, um, because it only in a very, I guess you could say, accidental way is going to influence the reading of sacred Scripture. And honestly, I don't want to hear the crying of by certain people, because everybody really does this. Because there's certain things in Scripture where you're going to need to have recourse to certain disciplines like history. You're not going to say when Scripture references a certain historical event, like for example, when Scripture references Alexander the Great, the Scripture says everything about Alexander the Great. No, of course not. That's just silly. We're going to be able to look at the contemporary historical records of Alexander the Great. And we know that Scripture is infallible. So, insofar as those other sources are going to represent Alexander the Great correctly, it's going to help us shed light upon what sacred Scripture has to say about Alexander the Great. And it's the same for natural concepts, such as virtue, such as justice, such as power, such as humanity, such as flesh, such as certain species of plant, such as person, such as substance, such as image, such as even things like priesthood. Certain natural religious virtues are going to help us understand these things. Because insofar as those other sources, whether it be philosophical authorities or whether it be our direct investigation of nature, insofar as there is a correspondence between that thing and reality, insofar as there is that correspondence, there's going to be a correspondence, secundum quid, between that authority and Scripture. And it's going to help us be able to interpret Scripture in a secondary way. And this is just, and if you already accept inerrancy, if you accept infallibility, then you should accept this. The only reason that this would be ridiculous if you are some sort of higher critic when it comes to Scripture. If you don't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, then the interpretation that is merely philological, merely grammatical, that's going to make sense. That's going to make perfect sense. But it's not how we interpret Scripture. It's not how we interpret Scripture at all. And then also, this is going to have to do with the fact that the mysteries which are revealed, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but the mysteries that are revealed are mysteries that, in order for us to cognize, require supernatural grace. So, if you don't got grace, if you don't have that supernatural principle residing within you, then you're not going to be able to correctly interpret Scripture. So we interpret, for example, the church. This is why the church fathers are so important in the Catholic tradition. They were holy men. They had certain circumstances where they were in an era of greater purity in the church. They were in a foundational period. They were closer to the context of the New Testament. Sure. All of those things. But a huge reason for their authority has to do with their holiness, has to do with their eminence, has to do with their piety. It has to do with a lot of these things. So some random autist on the internet with the ability to have a lot of different tools of interpretation that are objectively helpful, he's not going to be able to interpret sacred Scripture as well as St. Augustine is going to be able to, because St. Augustine has in greater degree the spirit that inspired the Scriptures. So like knows like, real knows real. Okay, so after that long aside, let's get into it. So there seems to be a lot of confusion about how this works. Many are going to the way in which they view like the authority of the fathers or the authority of the magisterium when it comes to interpreting sacred scripture, they're going to view it in a very weird way. It's like there kind of has to be this definition where Pope Francis stands up and says, like, uh, I, Pope Francis, say that this is the correct interpretation of Romans 1:3, and everybody has to take it like this. Or when it comes to the fathers, they think they think what we need to do is we need to just like ransack every single father and look how they interpret it, and that some sort of like different application of the text or a different allegorical interpretation of the text that's somehow going to destroy the usage of the fathers and of the magisterium when it comes to the reading of scripture. But that's not the case. So when it comes to the fathers, and this is also applicable to the theologians, although in a lesser degree, first, it has to be an interpretation of a text of scripture that is unanimous, morally unanimous. And this is important when we say morally unanimous. So, for example, you can look at certain eminent fathers who are representative. So, if you have Chrysostom, Augustine, Jerome, Isidore, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, Athanasius, if you have like a bunch of big names who are all agreeing when it comes to the interpretation of a certain text, you can the consensus of the fathers works, or it can be of one area. So if the entirety of the West interprets a certain text the same exact way, because of the fact that the East and the West have to, by the working of the Spirit, retain when it comes to their divine traditions. Unanimity in their fathers, although obviously schism can happen. It did happen. If you're able to verify it for the East, all of the Eastern fathers say this, or if you're able to verify for the West, all of the Western fathers say this, then that qualifies for a morally unanimous consensus. On the other hand, if you can demonstrate that it's like this during a single time, so if you demonstrate that the fathers of the 6th century or the 5th century, the 4th century interpret a text of scripture in the same way, then that also counts for the morally unanimous consent of the fathers, because we believe in the indefectibility of the church. So we're going to say that the church has the same faith in all ages. So it doesn't matter what time you garner this morally unanimous consent. So this is the same way for the theologians as well. Second, we have to say that it implies a positive assent. What do we mean by this? Implies a positive assent. So they're teaching this authoritatively. They're going to be teaching this authoritatively. So if you can find, I don't know, 15, 20 fathers of a certain era, which make up most of the corpus, and they're all agreeing and they are teaching this as the interpretation, maybe not something which is like merely conjectural or some other way, but actually like all of the commentaries of the era are going to propose as true and as of the faith this, then it's going to be something which is part of this. And lastly, it has to be an object of faith. So, for example, if the fathers are going to interpret some sort of town in the Gospels as being a certain town, but they were just wrong about it, that doesn't qualify, because we say that the faith must be preserved. We don't necessarily say anything about the interpretation of a town must be preserved. So upon this, the fathers become an absolutely certain criterion of the sense of Scripture. So now the difficult part, and this is going to be the way in which the magisterium is going to be an authority, and a lot of people take this weirdly as well. But now that I've gotten here, I wanted to just let everybody know, if you want to see the rest of this and you're not a patrons, you shall be watching the rest of this. But the rest of you, sorry, I'm just going to cut it off here before I get into the magisterium. But if you want to become a patron, patreon.com/militantthomist, I hope you all who have to leave right now, have a fantastic rest of your day. God bless.